Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's discussion, which explores cross-cultural encounters in early literatures and cultures. I'm Rachel Scott. I'm a lecturer in World and Hispanic Literatures at Royal Holloway and a researcher with Language Acts and World Making. This was a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Open World Research Initiative between 2016 and 2020. And is now an interdisciplinary research centre at King's College London. I'll be hosting tonight, and joining me are Dr. Shazia Jagot and Dr. David Torollo. Shazia is a lecturer in medieval and global literature at the University of York. Her research combines her interest in both English and Arabic literature of the pre-modern world. She's currently writing her first book, Distilling Chaucer, Arabic Learning and the Islamic World in 14th Century England, which will set out Chaucer's Arabic sources. Shazia also sits on the managing committee for the EU Cost Action Network, Islamic Legacies in Europe, and she is a co-editor of the journal Post-Medieval. David is lecturer in Jewish Studies at the Complutense University of Madrid and a member of the Travelling Concept strand of Language Acts and World Making. His current research focuses on the circulation of wisdom literary texts in Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, and Judeo-Arabic among Jews, Muslims, and Christians in medieval Iberia and its Mediterranean border zones. I am incredibly pleased to have them here with us tonight. Their work is fascinating, and I think for me it raises really important points about the way we study and teach medieval literatures and cultures, and in particular they offer transnational viewpoints that go beyond and often challenge Eurocentric perspectives on the Middle Ages. Before we hear them speak, however, I wanted to give some context for tonight's event. So this discussion is part of a series of talks and for an exhibition called Kalila Wa Dimna, Ancient Tales for Troubled Times. I'm just going to share my screen so you'll be able to see. So it's as I said, the exhibition is called Kalila Wa Dimna, Ancient Tales for Troubled Times, and it's being curated by Ghazaleh Zogheib and Rania Mneimneh. And Ghazaleh is a researcher and arts educator with a background in literature, and she's joining me as co-host this evening. The exhibition is being held at the P21 Gallery in London until the 11th of June, and it's funded by Arts Council England and Language Acts and World Making. And if you are in or are planning to visit London before then, please do stop by and see to the gallery and see it, because it's, well, I am biased, but it's been a really wonderful project to work on. All of the artworks in Ancient Tales for Troubled Times are inspired by an ancient collection of fables known in Arabic as Kalila Wa Dimna, which I imagine some in this audience tonight might be familiar with. In particular, the exhibition focuses on one of the book's chapters, the chapter of the Ring Dove, or the Tale of the Four Friends, which, to summarize incredibly simplistically, is a tale of friendship in the face of adversity between different individuals who are represented by four animals: a crow, a mouse, a tortoise, and a deer, who at first appeared too different to get along, yet who are over time recognize each other's worth and come to a mutual understanding. And along the way, the animals debate the nature of friendship, as well as philosophical questions about material wealth, poverty, misfortune, destiny, and the acquisition of knowledge. And if you go to the exhibition's website, which Ghazaleh is going to put in the chat, you'll find lots more information about the artworks on show, about the artists and the book. You can watch an animated version of the tale and download a version to read for yourself. And the artists involved in this project include professionals, who have a long international reputation. They've got long-standing experience of exhibiting their work, but it also includes young refugees and asylum seekers from a charity in Croydon, primary school children from East London, and members of participatory textile group in East London as well. And the concept behind the exhibition was that these artists would become hakawatis, and they would continue an ancient Eastern tradition of storytelling, reinterpreting the tale in different ways to explore issues such as identity and community, migration and poverty, translation, language, and humanity and the natural worlds. And the resulting works are really thought-provoking as well as being really visually stunning. But I'm mentioning them and the projects not only because the talk tonight falls within our events program, but also because they are an example of the way in which the past is not only present, but highly relevant, and they show the real richness of medieval and earlier literatures and cultures. And the book at the heart of this exhibition, Kalila Wa Dimna, is also an example of the themes of tonight's discussion, which is the movement of culture and cultural objects across time, space, languages, faiths, and more. And I wanted to kick off tonight by showing you the map of the book's transmission from its origins in India in the 4th century through to Middle Persian in the 6th century and onwards to Arabic in the 8th century. And you can see that from this point, it really explodes and becomes a global work, or near global, where it's traveling into the Iberian Peninsula and on through into North and Western Europe, as well as back through to Persian and other languages in the East. And I wanted to start with this example because I think it exemplifies, as I said, the theme of tonight and the topic of tonight. And the reason for that is I've got a couple of lovely slides here of the medieval manuscript that I'll come back to later. It's because for me, this is more than a book of stories. It really does, the journeys that it takes exemplifies how it's a tale of cross-cultural encounters. And a scholar called François de Poix, who's worked on the journeys that Kalila Wa Dimna has taken, talks about it being a remarkable document of the history of contacts between civilizations. And for me, this really resonates with the work of Shazia and David, who are now going to hand over as they have some really interesting presentations for us tonight. And each of their presentations are going to be hinging on a particular object that's traveled, but they're going to be thinking about this object in a dynamic way, unmoored from concept or ideas of single origins or meaning. And so I suppose the aim of this evening's chat, or one of the aims, is to explore the medieval world as a period of mobility, of exploration and discovery, which of course had negative as well as positive implications, and of course of cross-cultural connections and encounters. David's talk will be about the Book of Chess and translating animals across cultures. And Shazia will be talking about mechanical flying horses in Chaucer and 1001 Nights, which sounds brilliant. As you can see, like Kalila Wa Dimna, this book of fables narrated by animals, there's a common thread here of animals talking or being or doing. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to David, who's going to kick off our talks tonight with his presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Please let me share my presentation to begin with. Here it is. Hopefully you can see it right now. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. So as you can see on the slide, I will briefly and superficially talk about one medieval work called the Book of Games, also known as the Book of Chess, Dice, and Tables. I will first introduce the book and then focus on an animal that is indirectly connected to the content of the book, but that connects very nicely with my academic interests and the topic of the conversation we are having right now, East-West encounters in early literatures. We know from the colophon that this book was completed in the city of Seville in 1283, making it one of the last works to be commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile. A colophon, for those of you who don't know what it is a paragraph usually at the end of a manuscript that contains vital information about the author, the copyist, the place and date of production, and other technical issues. And you can see the colophon of the Book of Games on the screen. That says, in the English translation, this book was begun and finished in the city of Seville by the command of the very noble King Alfonso, the son of the noble King Fernando and Queen Beatriz, Lord of Castile, León, Toledo, Galicia, Seville, Córdoba, Murcia, Jaén, Badajoz, and Algarve, in the year 32 of the king's rule, that is the year 1283. The Book of Games is a compendium of games taken from the rich Oriental tradition, especially Indian and Persian, through Arabic sources that were translated in 13th century Iberia. In the prologue, the king says that entertainment is necessary to be able to cope with the difficult reality of life. And before getting into details regarding the rules of the three games, the book offers us an exemplum or a parable to categorize each game. The king wants to know what is the most important quality impacting human life, and three sage men gather and discuss about intelligence, chance or luck, and common sense. Each sage defends one of the qualities and illustrates that with a game. Chess, which represents the intellect, dice, which represents chance or luck, and tables, to emphasize common sense. Then the book is divided into three parts, one on chess, one on dice, and one on tables. And the games are each linked to different social classes and attitudes, and therefore also play an exemplary role. This book is richly illuminated, and that means it contains many images that depict the rules of games, strategies to win, and even players and playing settings. Let's see some examples. On this slide, we can see 4 instances of people playing chess. Each of these illuminations accompanies the explanation of a strategy to win the game. But the first thing that catches our attention is the huge chessboard being used on the right. And that is the case because the book also offers instructions on how to play a game that it calls the big chess. But if I have put these images together, it's for you to realize that both men and women, Christians and Muslims, religious and laymen, black or white, could play chess and are portrayed as legitimate players. On the left, the upper image has 2 Templar knights. The one in the middle depicts black Muslims. The lower image, 2 court women, and the image on the right, 2 sages. It is therefore a game for everybody, since everybody must cope with the difficult reality of life, and therefore find amusement and entertainment in the games. This image shows the game of dice, which, as the prologue says, is all about luck and chance regarding numbers, and there is nothing you can do about it. And here we have another game of dice on the left and 2 instances of tables on the right. They are playing different versions of backgammon, which is still a game very much appreciated in the contemporary Middle East. Remember that the sage in the prologue said that tables are about common sense, because even though the dice might give you a number that you don't like or that you don't need, you must use your common sense to make the most of it and move the pieces intelligently according to that number. So a combination of luck and intelligence is required. But let's focus now on the pieces of chess. Here you have the common pieces used in Europe: the pawn, the rook, the king, the queen, the bishop, and the knight. But I would like you to pay attention to this piece, which is the bishop. Why? Because it wasn't always a bishop. Before, it was an elephant. And here you can see some ivory and wooden elephant pieces that have come down to us. You might be wondering why an elephant? Well, this makes total sense because I remind you, chess has its origins in India. Chess evolved from an ancient Hindu game called Chaturanga, which combined dice and pieces. Originally, the game pieces included a king, his counselor or minister, later his queen, 2 elephants, 2 chariots or boats, 2 horses or camels, and 8 soldiers. These represented the 4 traditional Indian army units: elephants, cavalry, chariots, and foot soldiers. And in the photo of this sculpture from the 5th century BCE in Sanchi, India, you can observe an army participating in a war over Buddha's relics that took place in that period, form of chariots, we can see it here, elephants, around here, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Of course, Persian culture, in close contact with India, also included elephants as war machines. On this slide, you can see one example of the legendary Persian king Khosrow riding an elephant and fighting against cavalry in a beautifully illuminated Persian miniature. Or another manuscript image depicting 2 elephants kept at court. And we know that because of the hats they are wearing and the jewelry in their legs. Or this image in a 17th century manuscript depicting the Mughal Shah Jahan observing his sons, Prince Aurangzeb, thrusting a spear into the trunk of a charging elephant, which was supposed to be fighting another elephant, the one we see in the background, in the famously known elephant fights, but that seems to have escaped. Coming back to medieval Europe, do you find any differences in the depiction of elephants in these Oriental manuscripts? In these European manuscripts? Well, it is clear that these illuminators didn't know what an actual elephant looked like. They had probably never seen one. They seem to have an idea, though. The illuminators of medieval manuscripts were specialists in just that, illumination and drawing. And in most occasions, they would receive a copied manuscript with gaps and a brief description of the content of the image they should draw in that gap. So it seems that at least they have read descriptions of what elephants looked like, probably in the same text of the manuscript they were illuminating. But it is clear that they have never seen an elephant in real life. These 3 manuscripts are now preserved in the British Library. In the Rochester Bestiary, a bestiary is a treatise containing descriptions on various kinds of animals, the painter does know the fact that elephants were used in battle alongside or against horses. But he wasn't that precise in the physical appearance, size, or proportion of the elephant. The upper image on the right side, from a mid-15th century manuscript from Italy, depicts an elephant that looks like a horse with a trunk and 2 tusks. And the other image, well, the manuscript is called Marvels of the East. And we have this kind of tiger elephant, indeed a real marvel. Elephants have been used in war since always. War elephants were usually deployed in the center of the line and were also used to carry heavy materials across difficult terrain before tanks and helicopters were an option. And you can see this image from the First World War. Unlike cavalry, elephants didn't fear infantry lines bearing spears, and the mere sight of elephants charging was enough to break lines and cause many soldiers to flee in terror. Only cannon fire made the war elephants impractical and useless, because due to the huge size, they became an easy target for cannons. And here we arrive at the heart of the matter. Why did a chess piece depicting a war elephant change into a bishop? Unfortunately, it's not exactly clear why the elephants turn into bishops, although some scholars think that it might happen after the more abstract Persian chess pieces included bumps to symbolize tasks that may have reminded some people of a bishop's mitre. In fact, it is called a bishop in several places, as you can see in this map, in Iceland, Ireland, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. In a few countries in Central Europe and the Scandinavian Peninsula, such as Germany, Poland, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and others, this piece is called a messenger or a runner, while France, Hungary, and Moldova call it a jester, and the ex-Yugoslavian republics in the Balkans call it a hunter. It is therefore clear that we have before our eyes an instance of cultural translation, that is, translation that takes into account cultural awareness in its methods. As the game of chess spread from India and Persia towards Europe through the Islamic world, elephants became bishops, or messengers, or jesters, or hunters. In any case, members of the court that were important for the well-being of the royal family, either in faith, the bishops, war, the messenger, or amusement, the jester or the hunter. An elephant didn't seem to have any use in European courts or armies. So what could its role be in a game like chess for European audiences? The new audience adapted the name of the piece to its understanding of the function of the elephant in battle and strategy, which is what chess is about. Curiously enough, and highlighting the mediating position between East and West, Iberian languages like Spanish, Catalan, or Galician name this piece al-fil, which means literally in Arabic, the elephant. Al is the article and fil means elephant, al-fil. The Arabic term remained when the Book of Games was translated from Arabic into Spanish in the 13th century, probably because the association of elephants with the piece appearance was lost with the passing of time. But the name changed in Europe for an audience that was never in contact with the Arabic tradition as Iberia was. The reasons, motivations, form, and chronology of these changes in medieval literary works is what I explore in my research. I particularly focus on wisdom works, that is, collections of exemplary tales, anthologies of proverbs, wisdom poetry, and sayings of philosophers that teach moral, political, and social pragmatism to properly behave as a human being in society. And if you want to know more about my research project titled The Boundaries of Wisdom, I believe the link will be shared in the chat, but I'm also happy to answer any question you might have in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing how we can make connections with Shazia's work as well, particularly given that she's looking at animals too. At which point, Shazia, I will hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, David. That was really wonderful. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. So hello, everybody in the Zoom room. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get going. So can you all see that? Can everyone? Brilliant. Okay, and just... Okay, brilliant. So I am also going to talk a little bit about animals, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about mechanical animals and flying horses. And so I've kind of taken the animal theme and here and thinking about the animal in a conceptual way. So the object that I've chosen is not something that I can physically show you in the same way that David showed you those wonderful images of those chess pieces, but actually a conceptual idea, an idea that we find in imaginative literature in the medieval period. So in texts that are considered to be kind of romance genre texts in the medieval period, in French and English, but also in Arabic. And just to note that in the medieval period, we often find similar themes, similar ideas, similar characters appearing from one romance text to another romance text. So imitation is the kind of best form of flattery, and medieval writers really took that quite seriously. And here I want to think a little bit about the kind of similarities that we find across a couple of texts. So one of them is an English text, and it's a text by the cliched father of English poetry, Geoffrey Chaucer. And then I want us to move a little bit to thinking about a similar conceptual idea, similar kind of mechanical flying horse that we find in the Alf Layla Wa Layla, the 1001 Nights. And then I'm just going to pose some questions at the end to think a little bit about how stories travel and what kinds of questions we can ask about traveling stories, which I think will kind of take us into the discussion a little bit as well. So I'm going to start then with Geoffrey Chaucer. So I'm going to start in 14th century England, which is when Geoffrey Chaucer is writing a whole series of different works, including the Canterbury Tales. And the Canterbury Tales is a series of tales told by various pilgrims on their way from Southwark in London across to Canterbury. And it has this kind of nesting structure. So we have tales within tales. And that same kind of nesting structure we find in the 1001 Nights, for instance. Same nesting structure we also find in Kalila Wa Dimna. And it's likely that that similar nesting structure was something that was known in Northern Europe through the through these kind of translations from Arabic and Persian. We know that Boccaccio in Italy is writing a text called the Decameron, which also has this nesting structure, which is Chaucer's direct source, really. So Chaucer is reading an Italian text when he writes the Canterbury Tales, where we get this nesting structure in English. I wanted to focus in on one of the tales in particular, and that is by Chaucer's pilgrim, the Squire. And the Squire is the second highest ranking pilgrim in the Canterbury collective. He's the son of the knight. He's considered to be this lusty young bachelor, and he tells a story that is a medieval romance, and it's a story that Chaucer never got round to finishing, so we only have half of the story, and it's a story itself that is nested, so there are tales within tales, and it would have been fabulous, I'm sure, if he'd ever got round to finishing it, but he never did, so we only have half of this tale. And this tale itself is set in the East. It's a tale that Chaucer sets in the Mongol kingdom of Sarai, he calls it. And it's set in the court of a Mongol king who in Middle English is known as Cambayuscan. And that Middle English word is considered to be the name Genghis Khan in modern English. So he's in the court. So we're in the court of Genghis Khan. And the romance begins with Genghis Khan's birthday. So it's Cambayuscan's birthday, there's a feast, there's a banquet, and this is the way in which medieval romances often begin. And one of the guests that appears at this banquet is an envoy who comes from, who is sent to the court of the Mongol king by the king of Araby and Ind, is the line in the Middle English. So the king of Arabia and India, so which is incredibly startling to have these two kind of geographies kind of all put together under one crown. This king sends an envoy across to the Mongol court, and this envoy brings with him 4 gifts. So these are gifts that he's there, you know, he's kind of, it's a good kind of tradition, custom to be hospitable and to bring gifts when you go to someone's birthday. So he brings these 4 gifts, and these are marvelous, wondrous gifts. And one of these gifts is a steed of brass, so a horse made of brass that's able to take somebody wherever they want to go within the space of 24 hours. He also brings a mirror. So this is what you can see on the slide, the quote that I've got on the slide, the mirror, which allows you to kind of foresee any kind of adversity, but also see if somebody is your friend or your foe. A magical ring that allows you to communicate with birds, or at least listen to what the birds are saying and understand avian speech. And a sword that will allow one to both harm in the way that swords do, but also heal as well. So it has this kind of double function. And it's the this kind of horse that's made out of brass that I wanted to focus in on a little bit. So this horse that's made out of brass can, Chaucer tells us, in the space of one natural day, so in the space of 24 hours, take somebody wherever they desire, whether or not in drought or else in showers. It allows you to bear your body into every place to which your heart wishes to go, without harm to you through foul or fair, or if you desire to fly as high in the air as does an eagle when he desires to soar. This same steed shall bear you evermore, without harm, until you be where you wished, though you sleep or rest on his back, and return again with twisting of a pin. He who made it knew full many an ingenious contrivance. He observed many a configuration of the stars before he had finished this operation, and knew full many a magical seal on many a controlling force. So this is the translation that is in the modern English. And as you can see at first glance, when we're thinking about this horse, it's a magical horse. It takes you, it has these kind of supernatural powers, or almost. It can take you wherever you want to go, however you want to get there within a short space of time. And she also really emphasizes the wishful desires that kind of propel the horse into action. So we see that with that kind of the way that he talks about your heart, where your heart wishes to go, thinking about desiring to fly as high in the air, as high, to kind of soar as high as an eagle. But it's not just wish fulfillment that makes this this brass horse move. So, you know, you're thinking about this kind of this horse that's made out of this really kind of sturdy material, right, kind of out of brass. It is actually a mechanical horse. In order to operate it, you have to twist a pin. So he says you return again with a twisting of a pin. And in those last few lines there, he kind of changes tack a little bit, and he tells you a little bit about this as being created by somebody who had an ingenious mind, so somebody who is able to operate kind of the mechanics of this machine and create a mechanical machine, somebody who's able to understand the constellations, the configuration of the stars. So he puts this within the idea of a cosmos as well, and that he's also able to, he also has some kind of magical abilities as well. So he brings that in towards the end as well. But there's a sense that he has really kind of knowledge here, mechanical knowledge, in creating this brass horse. So we have a mix here of the mechanical and the marvelous. So this is written then at the end of, towards the end of the 14th century by Geoffrey Chaucer, written in Middle English. But we find a similar horse that operates in a kind of similar way in a text, in an Arabic text, in the 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla, in a cycle of tales that often called the enchanted horse in English, or the ebony horse in English. And if you know anything about the 1001 Nights, you know that it's quite a difficult text to pin down itself. It's an unstable text in all kinds of glorious ways, really. We don't really know who wrote it. We know that it's kind of performed orally. We know that there are collections of texts that appear in different kinds of manuscripts in different ways and different formulations. And it's a text that really in the 18th and 19th centuries, kind of when it starts to form into the text that we kind of see today. If you go and pick up a Penguin Classics of the 1001 Nights, you would have those kinds of collections that come out of those European translations. So in many ways, it itself is a kind of an unstable text in kind of the way that it travels. But this ebony horse cycle of texts is one that contains a similar horse that moves. And I'll just, if I can, I'll just read out the quote on the slide, which is just a snippet from the beginning of this translation, which comes from Malcolm Lyons' Penguin translation that you can pick up in any good bookshop. So here he says, the king said that he must first test the horse. Whoopsie, excuse me. And somebody came forward and said, I shall mount it and try it out, father, to see how useful it is. The king gave him permission to do this, and as the prince came up and mounted it, but however much he moved his legs, the horse would not budge from where it was. Where is the speed that you claim for it, wise man? The prince asked. But at that, the man came up to him and showed him a screw that would make it rise in the air. Turn this, he said, and when the prince turned it, the horse started to move and then flew up with him into the sky, going on and on until it was out of sight. So similar then to Chaucer's horse that kind of moves in a similar way, that moves with that kind of turning with the pin that Chaucer tells us. The ebony horse also works through a mechanism, a screw that switches on its kind of flight mode in order to get it moving. The screw motion itself is also emphasized, so you need to turn it in order for the horse to rise and descend. And aside from the young prince and the wise man in this particular, the tale, who know how it operates, the ebony horse, so it's only two people really who know how this horse operates in this cycle. So this prince and the wise man, and the rest of the people who kind of see it are kind of looking at it in wonder, and they see it in a kind of marvelous way, in the same kind of way that Chaucer's playing around with marvels and mechanics in the Canterbury Tales. So we see that quote on the slide there, where it says, "The ebony horse was a wonder, and no one had ever seen anything more handsome or better constructed." And I should also say that the ebony horse here in the 1001 Nights is a wooden horse. It's not a brass horse. And there are other reasons I think that Chaucer has described his horse as a brass horse, and I can talk a little bit more about that later on, perhaps. So did Chaucer know this story? This is a question that students often ask me in the classroom, where we kind of read the two texts side by side. And there are really no easy answers here. I don't know if Chaucer read the 1001 Nights, or if he had access to translations of the 1001 Nights. And actually, maybe the question really isn't whether or not Chaucer in England is hearing this story, but whether or not the question might actually be, how did tales from the 1001 Nights, this kind of enigmatic, elastic, ever-evolving text, how did they find their way into Northern Europe? How were they translated? How were they performed? Who was doing that translation? Who was doing that kind of telling of these stories? And how did they go from kind of an oral form to a written form? How did they go from different languages as well? So something that moves from Arabic into English. And we do have one possible example here of a kind of a mediation between Arabic and English, and that is from the French. So, so there is a French text, an old French medieval text called Cléomades, by somebody called Adonai Leroy. And this text is incredibly similar also to the Alf Layla Wa Layla with the ebony horse. It is also a text with a mechanical, magical horse that flies, with a prince, with a wise man, with similar kind of ideas about tests and love, which is what the ebony horse cycle is interested in. How did Adonai Leroy hear this story? Well, he possibly heard it from a Spanish version, so from a Castilian version of this tale. That was itself probably a translation of an Arabic version. So Iberia, we always come back to Iberia. I think it's the place where is a kind of source for all this kind of generation of translation and transmission. And it's likely Adonai heard this text and decided to write it down. And Chaucer may himself have heard this Cléomades text. He may have seen a copy of the Cléomades text. And those kind of questions are really interesting to think about, but they, like I said, have no easy answers. But certainly we can see from the literature itself that these ideas were really generative, that a conceptual literary idea that we find in an Arabic text can make its way into England, into an English text. And I'll just end by also saying that the end game here isn't the English text. So it's great that Chaucer has this in the Squire's Tale, and I'm really interested in thinking about those lineages of translation and transmission. But my goal isn't to say, well, England was the end game here, but actually to think a little bit about the cyclical nature of this. Because Chaucer, when he has this brass horse, this kind of mechanical and wondrous horse in this text that itself is set in the East, he's interested in the ingenuity behind this. He's interested in thinking about the East not as an orientalized exotic space, but as a space that has these wonders, this wisdom, these mechanics that can make things move, that allow you to see and understand the sky and the time of day and the constellations, for instance. So this ingenious contrivance, that line that brings us back to thinking about the East as a kind of generative space in all sorts of different ways. So I'll end there, and we can kind of think a little bit about those questions collectively even. Like I said, there's no easy answers, so I probably won't really have many direct kind of full answers for people, but I am interested in questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shazia. That was really, really illuminating. I wanted to, before we get on to discussions, to go back to the PowerPoint I had about Kalila Wa Dimna. And I think just draw together some of the things that you've both said in your presentations. With David, you brought in the political and the social aspect of the text, the fact that there was a range of social groups, of faiths, of cultures represented, and this was used, wasn't it, the book of chess to think strategically, to know the other, to learn how to analyze and strategize. And Shazia, with your wonderful horse, this opening up of the world of imagination, and a recognition of the East as a generative space. And that's something that we see with the reception of Kalila Wa Dimna as it moves from India through to the Abbasid Caliphate up, and interestingly, as you said, the Iberian Peninsula, because it's through Iberia that the book really found a home within European and Northern European languages. It's here that we have it translated into Hebrew, into Latin, and from there into French, Italian, German, and back into Spanish. And I really appreciated what you said about this idea of openness. You can see from the map that with Kalila Wa Dimna, we're not talking about a linear progression or a teleological progression that ends with, I don't know, the English version in the 16th century, but there's this constant cycle of renovation and reinterpretation and retellings. And this was something that we were really conscious of when we were putting together the exhibition Ancient Tales for Troubled Times, was the fact that the book doesn't have an endpoint like many other medieval books. It's a process, it's a dynamic process of exchange and adaptation and translation that is really enriching. And I wanted to I suppose end my little segment and bring it back to our discussion and chat by saying how there's a real sense of recognition of the East as a generative space when we see the translations that are made in the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages, and one in particular that was made by the same king as the text that David talks about, Alfonso X. There's a recognition that this book is an object of prestige, an object of wisdom, and that wisdom would be beneficial not only to Alfonso and his Castilian empire, but also for his people more generally. And there's a recognition that it comes from a place of great learning and great knowledge as well. Before we go to questions from the audience, I'm going to stop sharing now, so we can see each other. But I mean, I certainly have lots of questions about your talks, and I suppose I wanted to start with Shazia. You mentioned how that Chaucer brings in constellations and brings in knowledge of the cosmos. And do you think that he's thinking of the learning from learning of Arabic, from Arabic sources, from those books that he probably would have known about?
Oh yes, absolutely. And that kind of, so that there is a whole kind of other layer to those kind of the kind of constellations and the operations that we kind of see in that particular quotation from the Squire's Tale, that actually brings in another kind of object that also travels from the east to the west, which is known as an astrolabe. So this astrolabe is this mechanical machine. It's called a medieval supercomputer. It's kind of made out of brass as well. So there's all these connections to that connects the astrolabe to the brass horse in different ways, and it allows you to tell the time. And one of the things it allows you to do is tell the time, so the time of day, calculate the sun's position. You can use it for constructing buildings. It has like thousands of uses. And Chaucer's really interested in the astrolabe, and he writes a treatise on an astrolabe. Again, it's something that he never completely finishes. And we know that one of the texts that he's reading, that to kind of inform his own knowledge of the astrolabe, is a Latin translation of an Arabic text, which is a treatise on an astrolabe, which itself comes from Iberia. It comes from somebody called Ibn al-Safar, who's writing in the court of Majriti I can't remember his Muslim al-Majriti, sorry, yeah, who writes lots, who kind of leads lots of translation, including this kind of esoteric text called the Picatrix, the Khayat al-Hakim, in Arabic. So Chaucer is kind of in thinking about astronomy in particular. We know that there are kind of director lines kind of to Arabic text and Arabic learning, and certainly astronomical knowledge is really key to the way that Chaucer is thinking about his imaginative literature too. So there are other ways in which he brings in Arabic learning, which is kind of distilled because it's in its Latin translation. But he also is aware of that in his treatise on an astrolabe. He has a little section where he gives a kind of lineage of these the different languages in which these kind of which astrolabes, these treatises on astrolabes are written, including, he says, for Arabians in Arabic. So yeah, so there's kind of all sorts of layers of kind of knowledge and playfulness that he's kind of in his poetry as well.
Yeah, it's really layered, isn't it? There's a real sense that he's presenting a very almost simplistic view of the learning that he would himself have had. Yeah. David, I was wondering, when you were talking about the transformation of the piece from the elephant into the bishop, are there any locations in Europe or at this time when it remains an animal form, or is this sort of a transformation that happens throughout the European region?
Thank you, Rachel. This is a very, very good question. And I'm afraid I don't have a precise answer for that. I must confess that I am not an expert in the history of the transmission of chess or the pieces of chess. I just wanted to illustrate a cultural translation in literature through that image that would be, or that object that would be interesting for us to know. But as far as I know, the elephant appearance of the piece was already changed in Persia when the game of chess traveled from India to Persia. I mean, if I might share my screen again, just 1 second to illustrate that. I think you can see it right now. So if we look, for example, in how the pieces look like here, we don't see an elephant here, but this is the big chess, so it doesn't count. But this one, we don't see an elephant here anymore. So what we see is something like this, which is an elephant, even though it doesn't look like an elephant. It's the Persian abstraction of the elephant appearance. So we have the trunk and the tusk here, or one trunk and one, it's like an elephant looking upward. I mean, very abstract, but that's the shape of the elephant actually. So it changed in Persia before getting into Iberia and before getting into Arabic as well. So the image already had changed. What I was focusing about was on the name itself and how it continues through Persian. I mean, if we go back to the map, also in Turkish, of course, field, which must be, I mean, I don't know Turkish, but that must be elephant as well. And curiously enough, in the well, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian, they also call it an elephant. So what I wanted to point out was that the name remained as alfil, as an elephant, while the chess was moving through the north of Africa, India, Persia, the North Africa, and then to Iberia. But once it moved to the rest of Europe, the piece appearance had already changed in Persia, but the name already changed here around the 14th, 15th century. And each of those countries, or well, lands or cultures, translated it and adapted it in a different way. So the elephant form of the chess piece wasn't known in Spain anymore when it arrived here in the middle of the 13th century.
Yeah, and you can really trace, can't you, the links between the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa and the Middle East in that naming convention. We see something similar with the names of the animals in Kalila Wa Dimna, where the jackal becomes a fox because they didn't know what a jackal was.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Rachel, because actually in Kalila Wa Dimna, you are the expert here on Kalila Wa Dimna, but we have in the same tale that is at the base of this exhibition, the name of the turtle or the tortoise, the turtle. In the Hebrew translation, it is called Hayatayam. There was no name for turtle. I mean, there's a Hebrew term now, but at the moment there was no name for turtle in Hebrew. So the only way to define that was Hayat Ayam, which is the living being in the water or in the river. And in these translations, then both Castilian and Hebrew enriched their vocabulary and the way they describe prose. So we can say that thanks to this translation, not only of collections of fables or exemplary tales, but thanks to the translation of words on numerous and various topics like astrology, medicine, philosophy, and literature, Hebrew and Castilian prose were born in a way in the 13th century. I mean, secular Hebrew and Castilian prose were born also in the 13th century.
Yes, there's and this I think makes a link with Shazia, and you were talking about imagination, that this is a concept. This is Chaucer getting to grips with a concept of space and time, isn't it?
Yeah, and maybe I can use that as an opportunity to answer one of, so Shazia in the chat has put two really great questions, and one of them I think links to that kind of conceptual to also the kind of the technology as well. So it's both a kind of conceptual idea that we see that comes out of someone's imagination, but there are these automata, these automatic machines that are coming out of, as Shazia says, the golden age of Islam. So we know there's somebody called Al-Jazari, for instance, who writes a whole treatise on these kind of ingenious mechanical objects, and that these kinds of automatic machines, Al-Jazari has one that has an elephant on it that is, I don't think he ever actually made it, but there's definitely some really wonderful images of it in manuscript traditions, like a machine, I think it's a mechanical water clock with an elephant. And these kinds of automata, these mechanical machines, were found in courts. So in kind of courts in the Islamic world, we also find them in later on kind of versions in European courts, if I'm right, but at least we do have reports from travelers, for instance, who are going across to different courts and seeing these automatic machines, and then kind of writing down and saying, oh, I saw this amazing thing that has water coming down from it, or a marble comes out and it roars, or whatever. So there's a kind of a blending there of kind of the conceptual and the mechanical, which kind of goes back to kind of thinking about it as both a kind of a machine and also a wonder, a thing of wonder as well. Yeah, sorry, I just use that as a way of kind of addressing Shadia's question. And Shazia, your first question I think is really, really fascinating. And one, so this idea that, so this flying horse that kind of with Burak and thinking about it, if the mechanized nature of the horses compensate for the element of prophethood. I mean, that is a thesis, I think. I don't think I can really address it. I mean, there is a whole kind of trajectory of thinking about the prophet's ascension, this kind of Isra Miraj, and that narrative that we also find in medieval Europe. So with Dante's Divine Comedy, for instance, it has there's a whole kind of other trajectory there. But that question in particular is fascinating. Yeah, one I'd have to really think a little bit more about and discuss. If you have any ideas, Shazia, throw them out, definitely.
Yes, please feel free to unmute yourself if you prefer to do that rather than asking questions in the chat. But we have another question from Anissa saying, thank you for the fascinating talks. I was wondering whether in the course of your investigation you come across any signs of what was to be described later as Orientalism, has the marvel element when translated into European culture forms anything in common with the notion of the wonders of the East that Edward Said critiqued? David, shall we go to you, and then we'll come back to Shazia?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Anissa, for that question. I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that in the 12th and the 13th centuries, the Orientalist idea of appreciating the culture with a political agenda behind was there, because we have travelers in Christian Europe, and we also have travelers in the Middle East and the Muslim lands, traveling all over Europe and all over the north of Africa and the Middle East, describing what they see, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way. So I would think, again, I'm not an expert on that, but I would think that they try to depict an image of a place and a people that is not like the one they were used to, but not in a polemical way, even though there are polemical treatises as well, but not in a polemical way, but in an attempt to know other ways of human civilization, I would say. Maybe Shazia knows more about Said's critique of the East, but as I understand, Said concepts, even though the post-colonial and Orientalism idea can be applied to medieval Iberia as well, of the medieval Mediterranean, in the sense that we can categorize and interrogate questions of alterity and identity and belonging and not belonging in medieval Iberia. I believe that Said was more about the colonial enterprise of the European powers, like France and the United Kingdom mainly, in the wonders of the East, in the sense that you could control the other by controlling the way you portray them, or they are portrayed to you by your lens. And I haven't found, at least, that view in the manuscripts I have been working. If so, I have found the opposite, that the Arabic tradition as depositary of the Hindu-Persian, highly admired Hindu-Persian tradition, is something to be appropriated because it's good, because it's ancient, it's high quality, it comes from a culture or from a civilization of high sophistication compared to 11th or 12th century Europe. Therefore, you can only benefit from it. But it wasn't the idea of appropriating the culture to be able to subvert the political ideology of the enemy in that way. I find it difficult to find connections in the wonders of the East that Edward Said critiqued and the marvels of the East, which is the title of the manuscript that I show. But who knows? Maybe someone in the audience knows that better and can make those connections in a different way.
Shazia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think David really hits on an important point, which is context, really, and kind of historical context, and that, even within the medieval period, each region and each place and each century is kind of so different, kind of politically, and the way that it has those connections with the East as well. The 14th century England is a completely different beast to 12th century Iberia, for instance, in terms of kind of that kind of social and political context. I mean, certainly critics and scholarly criticism, so kind of academic criticism, has used Said to kind of look back and think about the kind of marvels of the East in various ways, although I can't really think of anybody right now off the top of my head who's done that, but you can think about kind of like a post-colonial Middle Ages, perhaps. There have been collections that are called edited collections that are called the post-colonial Middle Ages, for instance. So I think Said can be a kind of he can be kind of useful. It can be a good kind of combatant to kind of think a little bit about how we might think about Orientalism with a small o rather than a capital O, so not thinking about kind of empire with a big E, so thinking about kind of other kind of forms of imperial histories and other forms of kind of orientalizing that does happen in kind of both directions as well, right? That you also have people traveling in the other direction, or kind of looking across from east to west and thinking a little bit about kind of what's going on there.
We get travel narratives of scholars and writers traveling, like you say, from the Middle East to coming to to parts of Europe and writing their own marvels of culture. But I think as well we have to avoid essentializing that this was a period in which there was this tolerance. I mean, there are texts written that are very scathing about the religions, so from the perspective of Christianity, so non-Christian religions, so Jews and Muslims. They were what's the word? They were the focus of attacks on the basis of what we might think of racialized, of their religious viewpoints as well. So we can't either say that it was a period of total tolerance and respect for one another. But yeah, I would agree with David and Shazia that what we see is an acknowledgement at this point, certainly in the Iberian Peninsula, when Alfonso X is translating all of these texts from Arabic into the vernacular, into Castilian, that there's a recognition that there is a lack in Castilian culture that can be filled by appropriating this wealth of knowledge. But at the same time, he's also committing to continue the conquest of Muslim lands beneath Castile. So you get this tension between the recognition of the cultural worth and a desire to still have that there is still tension there, conflicts militarily, politically. Julian's popped Julian Weiss has popped a couple of references in there. Do we have any other talks from anybody in the audience? Okay. Jalil asks, are there known Eastern connections with other famous medieval stories such as Tristan and Isolde or Beowulf? Shazia, as the English medievalist, I will let you answer.
I think Beowulf is maybe a little too early, perhaps. I would say, and I'm not really so Beowulf is too early for me too as a medievalist. It's an early medieval text. Tristan and Isolde. I mean, I guess a comparable might be something like Leila and Majnun, or kind of the big famous story of the maddening passionate love between Leila and Majnun, which is kind of put down in verse form by Nizami, a Persian poet writing in the 12th century. And I'm not entirely sure of its kind of movement beyond Persian though. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the one that comes to mind right now. I'll keep thinking of that. I can see Julian has his hand up, so I'll put things in the chat if I can think of other stories.
Julian?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I mean, firstly, this is thank you both for tremendous papers, and I think although they're on different topics, they mesh very well, and I think that they address the question raised by Anissa in the chat a bit earlier about Edward Said. Earlier on, I made a reference to the clavileño episode in Don Quixote, and I did that because in that work you have a very clear example of this motif, but it's presented ironically in many ways. And one of the ways that's relevant to this discussion and the question raised by Anissa and others, and the issues of the Edward Said and post-colonial approaches, is that by the 17th century, there are different boundaries being drawn between East and West. In fact, the very categories of East and West have shifted. The article I put in the chat by Susan Conklin-Akbari, which is a good article, but I think deeply flawed, argues that the shift in the cosmographical account of the world, where East is actually North, the way the map of the world the mappa mundi shifts to the east is east. She argues that it takes place, predictably enough for an English scholar, in the time of Chaucer. You know, one could argue, you know, for and against that, for the 14th century being a shift. But I think it's later than that. And I think that David's paper, and I think that Shazia's paper also demonstrate that although there are boundaries clearly between Muslim, or the East, and what we now think of as the West, they're not half as marked as they are in later centuries. So it's a question of actually identifying, as Shazia said, the context, the discourse. So epic, there are clear signs of cultural boundaries being drawn, but in other texts, absolutely not. So I think that Edward Said's approach, although it's extremely enriching from many points of view, doesn't really help understand what's going on in the material being discussed today.
Thank you, Julian.
I mean, I don't even think Said was very much interested in the Middle Ages too either. I mean, he talks a little bit about Dante in his work, but really kind of glides over the Middle Ages as a period in history. Sorry, yeah, just wanted to throw that in.
I mean, I certainly have more questions that I would like to ask, but before I jump in excitedly, is there any others from the audience? Anything else that we'd like to ask Shazia and David in relation to their talks, which have been really, really rich and made so many connections in the way that cultures and names and animals travel as well. And I love how animals become this focus for much of medieval literature as a way of thinking about humanity and thinking about our society. I think in a way that maybe we've lost in modern or contemporary literary and cultural traditions. And feel free, audience, to step in with hand up or a question in the chat. But I did have a question I wanted to start with David, really. You've worked quite a bit on what we call wisdom literature and the types of texts written to advise rulers, it's like the Book of Chess, like Kalila Wa Dimna. And I suppose I wanted to ask, why do you think this type of literature travels? What is it about this genre, about this way of writing that traveled so easily from east to west, back again, crossing cultures?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. That's also a very good question. And I guess that the easy and basic answer would be, as some scholars point out, the universality of the message. I mean, wisdom literature is mainly about virtues and vices. And virtues and vices can be easily adapted for any culture, depending on religion. I mean, not depending on religion or language or place and time, because as human beings, we basically share the same ideas of virtues and vices. There can be some small differences in one of those virtues and vices and how or the way we look at them, but deep inside, the virtues and vices are shared by humanity. Of course, as you yourself have written in a recent article, we have to interpret the wisdom literature also depending on content, on context, on perspective, on language, on religion, because similar things may mean different things to different people. Or different things also may mean similar things to different people. So it also depends on context, as you were right to say. But the universality fact that all the wisdom literature, be it poems, wisdom poems, or animal tales or human tales, doesn't have to be animals, or proverbs that are attributed to Greek and Roman sages, because that gives like a kind of authority to the saying, to the moral teaching. They are quite easily translated, and they don't need much cultural adaptation to the new audience. Of course, we find sometimes that names are changed to make it sound more familiar. So things that are more familiar, we are prone, or we lean towards the acceptance of those things that we find familiar. Or if we find in a work maybe Quranic verses in Arabic, then in that translation into Hebrew or into Spanish or Castilian, there are different strategies that you can follow to adapt that. Either you look for biblical quotation, either in Spanish or in the Latin or in Hebrew, and then that meaning the same thing more or less, then you change it, or you translate the Quranic quotation without explicitly saying that it comes from the Quran, just in case that causes some problems in the audience. Either you delete that. I mean, translation in medieval times is not as we understand translation right now. It's about adaptation, imitation, additions, deletions. So we have a whole bunch of strategies to adapt the universal message. So in a way, the universal message needs to be adapted for contextual audiences. But I would say that the message is universal. I mean, universal like this.
Yeah, it's as if what brings us together is the search for knowledge, isn't it? It's the search for truth that we see discovered and explored through storytelling in many of these cases that brings together Chaucer, 1001 Nights, Kalila Wa Dimna. It's about interpreting the world through stories and about interpreting it through tales. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm afraid that those are the stories that we have in written stories. But of course, there is a whole oral and tradition of stories that we might not have the intermediary. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on Chaucer, but we might not have the tale where Chaucer got the idea of the flying horse. We don't have it in writing. I mean, written text, but it could be oral until the 13th or 14th century. Oral traditions were pretty much traveling as much as the written text, or even more, I would say. The same case we have with the Spanish El Conde Lucanor, where we have some stories that, of course, we can attribute to the Arabic tradition because of the names of the characters or the settings in Muslim Seville, for example. And in some instances, we do have in Arabic sources the same story in Arabic. In other instances, we don't. That doesn't mean that Juan Manuel, the author of Count Lucanor, invented the story. It could have arrived to him in a different way that we don't have written evidence of it.
Yeah, it makes me think, Shazia, before, I'm sure you've got lots to say there, when you were talking about how that tale of the brass horse is unfinished. And my first thought was, well, why is it unfinished? Is it unfinished because he just stopped writing it? Is it unfinished because there's no extant manuscript, that folio is lost, for example? I mean, could you say something about that before you respond to David?
Yeah. So that whole text is actually, I mean, that whole text is kind of resembles the 1001 Nights in many ways, because it's got 4 gifts, and these 4 gifts are given to the kind of 4 family members of the king, and that whole idea was that there were going to be then 4, because each gift would have its own tale, right? And that each, the person who receives the gift would have a tale. So we get a story of the ring that's given to the king's daughter Candace, and so we have her story of and it's to do with love, and kind of she hears a kind of, I think it's a falcon, and then we were supposed to have 3 other stories. So there's this kind of almost a kind of geometrical kind of playing going on with 4 and 4, and a nesting, and then all of this again is nested within the Canterbury Tales. But no, I mean, I don't think we know why it's unfinished. We just don't have a finished manuscript, and who knows, where something could turn up somewhere with a kind of a complete Squire's Tale, and then it was copied kind of unfinished too. So I don't really know why it's not finished. I mean, Chaucer doesn't, I mean, there's lots of things Chaucer doesn't finish. He doesn't finish the Canterbury Tales, for instance. He doesn't finish this treatise that he writes on an Astrolabe. I mean, he was also writing. Writing wasn't his day job. He was doing all sorts of other things alongside it. So, yeah, he
Can we
had.
forgive him?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
David,
Sorry,
sorry,
yeah.
Shazia.
No,
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to respond to kind of what David was saying earlier in terms of thinking about the strategies that we employ, that we need to employ as critics and academics and readers. That those strategies, we have to, the way that we think about the way that the strategies that translators use in the Middle Ages are kind of, it's adaptation. It's different to what we consider translation today. As critics, when we read back, actually, we have to employ different kinds of strategies when we're thinking about these relationships between texts and ideas, and understand that actually, things aren't always written down, and that having a written source, something in front of you, doesn't really give you any more evidence than actually in thinking actually about the environment itself, and thinking about the importance of orality, and thinking about the ways that things moved. And so one of the things that I also try to do in my work is kind of redesign some of those strategies and those approaches, and ask different kinds of questions to kind of move us away from thinking about that kind of direct written source as being the kind of holy grail and the only way you can kind of prove an influence on something.
Yes, there's a focus on origins, isn't there, on tracing a text back to the origin, and that strikes me as well. David, do you want to chip in?
Well, it was just a short question to Shazia, if I may. Do you happen to know, or do we happen to know, Shazia, what the three other gifts are apart from the flying horse?
Yeah, so it's a magical ring that allows you to talk to birds or listen or understand language of birds. So again, a kind of nice little animal theme there. A sword that can be kind of used for warfare, but can also heal a wound. And a mirror that allows you to see see any future adversity, and also see whether or not somebody is a friend or a foe as well. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I feel you said that before and I missed it. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's totally fine.
Oh, any more questions? As I said, I could ask questions all night, but audience, please do chip in. Tanjana, why does Arabic literature why does it not have a position after medieval literature in modern literature? So I think asking why is it not as prominent, is that the question? So why why is Arabic literature perhaps seen as less culturally valued, or has less of a position in world literature nowadays? I don't have an answer. Shazia, David?
Well, I can think of after the 15th and 16th centuries, Arabic literature started to decrease in number. Of course, we have Arabic literature. There is Arabic literature, but with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, then we have the bulk of literary works was in Turkish, of course with Arabic alphabet, and it wasn't until the 18th or 19th century with the Nahda movement that tried to revitalize the Arabic tradition, looking back and thinking, oh, what have we done? I mean, we were something a big civilization, and now Europe, with the Enlightenment in Europe, we are lagging behind. So in this moment, again, Arabic literature, mainly in Egypt, or well, in the regions of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, of course. So we have a proliferation of authors, both Muslims and Christians, writing in Arabic, literary works, poems, in journals and periodicals, to again revitalize the Arabic culture. But from the 15th till the 18th century, even though of course there is Arabic literature, it is true that it's considered, in comparison, always, the value is always relative, right? So it's relative to medieval production in Arabic, is considered of less quality or less prominent in that sense. But I'm not sure if that answers your question.
something
was
about
that?
shifting power, just the dynamics of power globally, perhaps, as you mentioned, with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, that the power dynamic shifts elsewhere in the globe, and you get a different culture, a different set of cultural norms, and production is viewed as being prestige and valuable. I mean, we have to remember that books aren't just books, are they? They're imbued with power, with dynamics of power, with dynamics of legitimacy, a desire to build into a culture a sense of identity and a sense of purpose as well. So when I think about literature, as we talked a couple of times about context, but for me, context is very important, you know, to consider when the book was made, but not in the sense of searching for an origins, but being aware of the dynamics that are imbued in the stories perhaps being told. For me, books are never just books, really. Shazia, I don't know if you want to come in, if you have anything to add. We are running out of time. We're going to be finishing up very soon. I wanted to ask one very more general question to end, really, is that we're all three of us medievalists, you know, our background is in medieval studies. And I suppose I wanted to end by asking, why do you think that this period is so particularly rich for exploration, why it continues to speak to us today? I mean, our exhibition on Kalila Wa Dimna shows this richness and the relevance, but I wanted to get your views on why it continues to hold our attention.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Shazia? Well, I believe that it gets attention because when we think of the medieval period, it seems distant in time. And of course, they have different cultural parameters to understand the world they were living in, different to ours. But at the same time, when you dig deep, then you understand that even though we are talking about different people in the sense that they inhabit a different world, the medieval period, they might have a different faith or speak a different language or live in different areas, then the human dynamics are quite similar. That hasn't changed at all. I mean, it has changed, but not as much as we would expect. So I think the interconnectedness of for example, in our area, the Mediterranean, and the interconnectedness of the medieval times to the modern times, I think is relevant today. And I don't mean by that we can learn how to live or coexist by reading and learning about medieval Iberia or medieval England. I don't mean that, because I really don't believe that. But it offers models for things, but not to happily live in coexistence. But again, I think the richness of the medieval period, which for a long time was neglected in favor of other periods, it's coming out now. And I just came back from a conference in Istanbul about the Mediterranean as an analytical framework. And it was wonderful to know about things that I have no idea about, Anatolia or Cilicia, those kingdoms in the Middle East, and how the dynamics in the relationship of the people, being them part of different cultures, different languages, and different faiths, are quite similar all over the Mediterranean. So for me, it's the universality. I would say.
Yeah.
That we don't like that much, but it still is a useful word an useful concept, key concept to use. Yeah.
And Shazia, what are your thoughts?
I think there's still just so much to learn and to discover and to know, and that, you know, even texts that have been read, you know, I work on a really canonical author that has been read for hundreds of years, where there's, you know, more criticism than you'd like to think really on Chaucer, and yet every time you read there's something new, kind of, you know, you're looking at it with fresh eyes, and there are new things to learn and to know, and I think that makes it kind of endlessly fascinating, and really, really, really rich, both as scholars but also as teachers when you're in the classroom too. Yeah,
I've always found for me it's always been surprising for students how global the Middle Ages really was, and how that if we look beyond these labels of English literature or Spanish literature or French literature, that it's so much more enriching to discover these intersections. You know, the fact that elephant, you know, who knew that the game of chess piece used to be an elephant? You know, I didn't know that. I mean, it's fascinating, and it talks about the quote that I said from Francois de Bois about how this book and like all of these texts that we discussed, it's about contact between civilizations, isn't it? It's about how it brings people together. I think on that note, we should end. I want to say thank you to our speakers, Shazia, Jagot and David Corroyo. It's been fascinating. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And also to remind you to check out our other events from the conference, which are taking place over the next, from our exhibition, sorry, got conferences on the brain. So exhibition events are continuing until the end of the exhibition on the 11th of June. So please check them out. They're on our website, which Zalia put in the chat earlier. And there's a range of things, another really interesting talk about conflict and art, and a couple of demonstrations if you fancy a culture hit. And yes, it's been really, really fascinating to talk with you both. Thank you so much for your contributions. And thank everybody for coming along on a Friday night. I'm so pleased that we got these numbers on a Friday night. So yeah, thank you very much and take care. And the recording will be on our website shortly. So thank you, it's been fascinating.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rachel.
Thank